My name is Sarah Woodard. I'm the branch supervisor for the Survey and National Register branch here in Raleigh. And today is our survey day. Tomorrow is our National Register Day, but obviously these two things interconnect and overlap. And we don't have a specified 106 time because also 106 overlaps all of these things as well. We're here to refresh knowledge and we're here to share knowledge. We have some presentations, but I hope we'll do most of this refreshing and sharing in a conversation manner. And if we give an answer to someone and one of y'all has some other experience that you want to share or a different answer to give, please do that. Some folks are competitors, but today I hope we'll be collaborators. So we are going to just jump right in. I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Darren Waters, who is our State Historic Preservation Officer, and also to Ramona Bartos, who is our Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer.
Thank you all. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you all for being here. I'm not going to take up too much time. I really came over just to tell you hello and to welcome you all here, especially in this room, and to really thank you for what you do across the state. Ramona knows, and if you've heard me say this before, I figured, I try to think, can I say something intelligent that they might serve everyone who is here well, or at least to encourage you in the work that you do on a daily basis. I mean, we see what is kind of going on in our society now and questions about the value of what it is that we do. But I had a conversation yesterday with my son, and we were talking about past decisions that we made that have affected his life now. And he said, well, I don't like to think about the past too much, Dad. I only want to think about the future. But the past, as we know, shapes the future. It can shape the future. And so I was reminding him of that. When I was a professor, three of my favorite people, and I have their quotes here, and I'll use these quotes simply because I hope that they will serve as a source of inspiration. To think about the work that you do on a daily basis. Ramona's heard me say this. One is from Edmund Burke, who I just am a big fan of Edmund Burke. And Burke talks about the value of the past. And one of his favorite quotes, he wrote this in his reflections on the revolution in France, but it's a statement that still sticks out to me constantly, where he said, the society is a partnership in all science, a partnership in all art, a partnership in every virtue and in all perfection. As the ends of such a partnership cannot be obtained in many generations, it becomes a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are dead and those who are to be born. So it talks about this historical continuity that we all participate in. And the work that you all do across the state is a part of keeping that continuity together, the importance of having that. It's interesting, I've become a really big fan of Alexis de Tocqueville, too. Those who knew me in Asheville, where I'm from, when I was still teaching, it became a running joke in Asheville that people would place bets on how soon I would quote Alexis de Tocqueville in any talk that I was giving. But Tocqueville is quite relevant, I think, to where we are today. And if you have never read Democracy in America, I really encourage you to read it because it really is kind of a reflection on who we are. I think it's very relevant to where we are now and the things that we're going through. But interestingly, he said about American democracy, he said that in the midst of the continued movement that agitates a democratic community, the tie that unites one generation to another is relaxed or broken. Every man there readily loses all traces of the ideas of his forefathers or takes no care of them. Again, he was concerned that there was this break between the present and the past and ultimately the future in our democracy. And you can kind of see that in some ways. Again, I would say the work that you do is helping to reinforce the importance of taking care of the ideas of our forefathers. So I appreciate that and continue to encourage you in that work. The last quote I'll give you is from another one of my favorite writers, Russell Kirk, in his book, The Roots of American Order, which he wrote during a time when there was a deep, deep decline in historical knowledge in the country, and he wrote the book in response to that. In the opening pages in the preface, he made this statement. He said, lacking the knowledge of how we arrived where we stand today, lacking the deeper love of country, which is nurtured by knowledge of the past, lacking the apprehension that we all take part in a great historical continuity, why a people so deprived will not dare much, sacrifice much, or take long views. Again, the work that you're doing is helping us to be able to take those long views of where we are and of our society and of this project that we're all a part of. So I want to welcome you here. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for participating in this workshop. I get the pleasure of working with this great team every single day. I deeply appreciate their passion for the work that they do. And so I thank them for the work that you all do every day, Sarah, and everybody who's here. So Ramona, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Waters. And I don't normally get to follow him in such an august place. Okay, very good. Well, I just want to welcome you all again, to extend our most hearty of welcomes, because we can't do the work that we're all called to do without you being a vital part of that. And so I won't do de Tocqueville, but I'll tell you about my Aunt Nora really quickly. My Aunt Nora was my grandfather's sister. And I'm a Murphy, so this is Nora Murphy. Unbeknownst to me till I was in high school when we came across her will, she had decided when I was 6 months old to entrust all of the family memorabilia. She was the keeper of all the photos and all of the artifacts and all the stuff. And she picked me out and put a history hex on me, for lack of a better term. And I think that somehow you're called to it. I think we're all here because somewhere deep inside of us is this need to help continue to bridge that generation to generation story, that we know where we came from and maybe where we're going. So I just want to thank you all very much for being here, and I really want to thank Sarah and our entire Survey National Register team that put all this together. It's not easy to put together an event in state government. There's a lot of paperwork, and there's a lot of preparation. So I just really want to thank Sarah and credit her and the team for putting together a really strong agenda too. So I'm really glad to see you all. We'll be seeing each other for 2 days now. And again, I don't think I've ever gotten to speak in here. So this is a really special occasion for me too. So thank you and welcome. We'll turn it over to Sarah to get us started.
Well, good afternoon. I'm hoping the water will stay here and I won't sling it over. That's the plan. If it's just far enough away, I can get to it, but not ruin the Capitol. My name is Beth King. I'm the Architectural Survey Coordinator for the SHPO. How's this mic? Do I need to raise this a little bit? Okay, let me do that. Is that better? Okay, great. All right, so like I said, I'm Beth King. I'm the Architectural Survey Coordinator for SHPO. I want to thank you all for being here today, taking an afternoon out of the office to come to the workshop. It's good to see everybody again after a little more than a couple of years now. And this presentation is organized a little bit like a choose your own adventure book. So I'm going to pause between sections. If there's something you want to talk about then, let's go ahead and talk about it. If you've got anything you want to say, any discussion you want to have, we've got plenty of time. If we don't get around to everything that's on my agenda, it's organized so that we can be really flexible in the moment. So feel free to ask questions, to break out. Well, we can break out in discussion if you want to. Just don't feel like there's any real strict agenda that we need to hold to as far as my presentation is concerned. The first thing that I'm going to do is introduce our survey team. And obviously, there are a lot more than just our survey team in this photograph, but it is pretty unusual to get Rebecca Spanbauer, Kelly Malloy, and Audrey Thomas all on the same outing. So here they are on a recent Survey and National Register branch trip to Person County, as we were wrapping up our Person County survey. Audrey works with me in the Asheville office. She is the survey specialist who's dedicated to our 25 western counties. And she's most recently been working on our comprehensive survey of Clay County, which just wrapped up last month and which we're really pleased and proud of. Kelly Malloy is still with us. She was with us last time in the role of the Emergency Supplemental Historic Preservation Fund grants. We are still doing almost all of those. We're still doing 5 of the 7. And so Kelly so kindly stayed on longer than she originally agreed to help us finish out those projects. And we are hoping she'll still be with us through the end of 2026. That's our plan. And then Rebecca plays a lot of different positions on our team. She is the person who has the most flexibility in terms of what we can ask her to do. And she does a little bit of everything. One thing she's done a ton of over the past year or so is map Rosenwald schools. We were tasked with the job of mapping all 810 plus of our Rosenwald schools, and as you can imagine, most of them have been gone a very long time. So it's a little out of the wheelhouse of what we normally do in the survey program, but we're between a third and 2/5 of the way done with it. We're going on a county by county basis. So Rebecca's been doing that on top of reviewing a ton of survey work that's been coming in from a variety of projects. And then new to the team since our last consultants workshop is Michael Williams. She's not with us today. She is a retired professor of folklore. She was my professor and Kelly's professor. And she is a really experienced surveyor in far western North Carolina. So she assisted us with the Clay County survey, and we hope that we'll continue to be able to use her in far western North Carolina. She's with us on a part-time, temporary basis. So this, of course, is our master map that we're always working towards completing. Not a lot has changed since we saw you 2 years ago. The one nearly blue county, of course, is Clay. They're in the very far southwest. And I have a star on Graham because that's what Audrey and Michael Ann have been working on recently. They've just completed the windshield scoping survey for Graham, and pending a whole lot of things that are a little uncertain right now, we have all of our fingers crossed that we're gonna deploy them out to Graham to do a true comprehensive survey this spring and possibly into the summer. Otherwise, we are still in progress on quite a few things that were in progress last time. And then here's our map. We are not doing a ton of municipal survey right now outside of countywide survey. So we're surveying municipalities that are falling into these counties, but with the exception of a couple of privately funded projects, every municipal survey we're doing is folded into a larger countywide effort. The blue stars are indicating things that we were working on last time we saw you that have completed in the meantime, and then the yellow stars are still our active projects. And then we also have a couple of survey publication projects that are in process. And with that, I'm gonna roll us into our top 10 reminders and tips that were crowdsourced from the survey team. Okay, so our first reminder / tip is communicate with us early and often, especially if the HPO is not your client. The reason that this is important is sometimes when a project is privately funded or locally funded, the local sponsor is assuming that the consultant is talking to us, and sometimes the consultant is assuming that the local client is talking to us. And then occasionally that means that nobody's talking to us, and we get somewhat surprised when a pretty complete survey project shows up. So just let us know what you're working on, and maybe we can support you. Certainly it helps our file room, it helps Andy, and it helps me and the survey specialist to have a plan for when you might be sending deliverables. Yes, Matt?
So how does letting you know affect the legality of time clocks on the processes? Like if we informally let you know we're working on something, does that trigger a section 106?
I think I should say in general that a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is what I call survey for survey's sake. I don't necessarily think anything I'm going to talk about runs contrary to the Section 106 process, but it isn't really tailored to Section 106. Sarah, do you have any follow-up about the NEPA question?
No, I mean, except to say that's probably really a Renee question, in terms of what exactly is going to trigger 106 and exactly when clocks are going to start.
Yeah. That also raises something I probably should have said from the start, so thank you, Matt. In our office, the survey, my role as survey coordinator, the survey team, what we're primarily reviewing is like survey for survey's sake, like dedicated survey, sometimes survey that's directly going to pipeline into the National Register, but anything that's starting from a Section 106 or a NEPA standpoint is going to run through Renee's branch first. So of everyone on the survey team, I'm the one that has a territory. None of the specialists have a countywide territory. So I review Section 106, but not until long after Renee and her branch have funneled everything through the process. It just comes to me the same way study list applications come to me. Okay, so number 2 is we use the time product payment schedule to plan our review schedule, and that's pretty similar to tip number 1. But if you know that you're not going to be able to keep the time product payment schedule, that's usually not a problem at all. But just let us know, because if we think we're waiting for something to come in on a certain date, then usually it's Rebecca. I'm usually thinking, what do I have Rebecca do for 3 days? But if it's going to be a week and 3 days, that really changes what I would ask her to do or what I would try to do myself before something's coming in. So we can always amend these. It's the easiest thing in the world. We don't mind doing it. But we do take them pretty seriously in terms of when we think we're going to need to jump on something. If you'd like to send us work samples early in the project, this can save a lot of time in the long run. And what we try to do is, if I know you're going to send me 10 files at the end of the week as a work sample, I'm going to try to turn that around, if not the next business day, within the next 2. Just so if the photographs are labeled incorrectly, there's only 10 batches that are labeled incorrectly, not 200. So this is something, especially if it's your first project with us, that we really encourage you to take advantage of, and we will try to turn that around absolutely as soon as possible. Sometimes people will send me 10 samples when they've got 200 in the hopper, and I would really recommend that you send me 10 when you have 10, just to save everybody some time on both reviewing and then having to fix little technical issues. Our district neighborhood area form can be a very efficient way to survey a lot of resources. So we really encourage people, for example, in a neighborhood that might have been built out at roughly the same, all at the same time, pretty similar ranch houses, pretty similar minimal traditional houses, or maybe it's a rural historic district of some kind or another where there's definitely something there, but maybe not every single building needs an individual survey file. We think that putting together an argument to call something a district or a neighborhood or just an area can be an efficient way to cover quite a few resources in a less paperwork-heavy method. And if you have any questions about the DNA form, our survey staff's always happy to talk through that and share examples. HPO Web is extremely trustworthy. To me, it's probably the most powerful tool that we're offering you all and the general public at this point, but it is not ironclad infallible. So if you see something on there and you're like, that has a black dot on it, but I really think it's still standing, just please go ahead and tell us that, because that is absolutely something that happens. A lot of HPO Web, things that haven't been surveyed in recent years, a lot of it was mapped from the old USGS quad maps that some of you remember. I have surveyed with USGS quad maps. I loved them. Sometimes somebody thought they were looking north when they were looking south, and they just circled the dot on the wrong side of the road. Stuff like that has happened. So I do think HPO Web is our strongest and best tool, but if you see a discrepancy, please don't hesitate to point it out. We'll be glad to get it fixed. We'll be really happy to get it fixed. Yes. Hey, Annie. Oh, sure. Let me go back. Let's go ahead and talk about it now, I think. Mm-hmm. I think that if you are making a status argument, you probably want to have, if not a photograph of every building, a really large sample. If you're using a DNA during a survey, and you're not planning to propose it for the study list, it's not a DOE issue, I don't think you need to photograph every building inside of it. There have been a few recent surveys where we've specified in the scope of work that we wanted a photograph of every building. That is usually if we think that somebody's gonna want to do a National Register project next. We tend to be a little more documentation heavy on those, but if you're surveying it because it's important and you think there needs to be a record of it, you don't have to photograph every building. You don't have to go down the street. Especially if it's kind of neighborhood that lends itself well to street shots. Some neighborhoods, there's so many mature hardwood trees that there's no good time of year to photograph down the street. But if it's the kind of place where the houses are pretty close to the curb and the landscape's not intrusive, I think that those street shots are probably more valuable than individual. And we have used the DNA recently where the SHPO was not the client, and the client wanted a photograph of everything. But when we're going to require that, it's going to be specified in the scope of work. So you won't be surprised. Sure, thank you for the question. Okay, so number 6 is maintain consistency across survey products. And this comes into play a lot, I think, when there are teams of people that are putting survey files together. So make sure if some things get entered into the database one way, make sure that the label is the same on the site plan. If different people are labeling different photographs, make sure everybody is using the same labeling convention. Just have someone on your team, if you've broken up your work that way, who's QCing the whole thing to make sure that it's consistent across the board. We often will see, it looks like one person is probably filling out the drop downs in the database, and then somebody else is writing the narrative summary. So make sure that everyone on your team agrees on what a 1-story house versus a 1.5-story house is. And then mobile devices and DSLR cameras serve different purposes. So we all carry around really powerful, excellent cameras in our pocket or in our purse every day. But mobile cameras or iPads, they just don't zoom. You're just not gonna get a detailed photograph of the 2nd story or 3rd story of a building if you're using your cell phone. So there's certainly nothing wrong with a photograph taken by a mobile device. The Park Service accepts them, we accept them, of course if they meet minimum standard. But your DSLR camera, especially if you are having to photograph at a distance, is always going to be a totally different output and product than trying to use, say, an iPad. And then a site plan should demonstrate the relationship among elements at a given site. So what we're hoping that you're giving us a visual representation of is how the site functions, how everything there hangs together in a historic sense. It is not just a list of attributes of the site, but just a fuller visual understanding of how this place functioned, how it worked, how the patterns of movement on the site happened. It should help you to not have to write description in such painstaking detail. just like a photograph is worth 1,000 words, a site plan can do the same thing for a function of a site. When you're building your historic and architectural context, start locally and expand your focus gradually outward. Most of the time, the thing that you're surveying is probably most likely to be significant at the local level, if it's significant with a capital S at all. So make sure that you're starting there at the site, learning everything you can about the site, and then maybe start comparing it to, that side of the county or its nearest neighbors before you start looking statewide for context. And then last and most importantly, we hope that you will view our survey staff as a resource. All of us are people who are really happy to take a call or to do a Teams meeting or to just have an email exchange and provide some examples. We'd really, really like to be a resource for you early in the project and as often as we can, and to stay in communication with you throughout the review process. So please don't hesitate. Everyone on our team right now is a people person and an outgoing person. So we're excited to hear what's going well. We're not excited to hear what's not going well, but we'd love to be a shoulder to cry on if you need one. So, all of us have an experience of having at least one county survey under our belts, and we've done municipal surveys, so we know the highs and lows of the business, and we just hope we can be here for you in whatever way you need. Okay, and then I know we've already done some questions, but I'm going to pause a minute to see if anybody has anything else. Right. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about field work. So at the HPO, we often say that the survey program is at the root of all of our other programming. As of Monday morning, there were roughly 142,000 records in our statewide archive, which is an increase of almost 5,000 records since we met 2 years ago. And there are a lot of people in this room whose professional lives have been archived in our survey files. Some of those people are currently or have been employees of the HPO at some point, but most of our prolific surveyors made their contribution as consultants. So we both acknowledge and appreciate that the bulk and the body of our statewide architectural survey has been the result of consultants, and we thank you for that. We believe that survey is at the root of all our programming because it builds context for our status decisions, it informs our interactions with our constituents, and it creates a lasting record that partially mitigates the inevitable loss of tangible and intangible heritage. So fieldwork is the heart of our survey program. Time spent on site in direct contact with historic resources and the people who made them, use them, or remember the people who made and used them is essentially the foundation of historic preservation. What is the cultural context of a historic property? What did it mean to the people who created and or used it, and what does it mean to someone who remembers the people who created and used it? Fieldwork should be about raising or shaping and answering questions. We certainly don't expect that when you head out into the field that you're going to know every question that you need to ask in the survey area, but we do hope that as you move across the landscape, that questions will be presenting themselves to you, and we hope that those questions will also be answered by doing fieldwork. Fieldwork also demonstrates that use or function is as important as style, design, or construction. I think it's really tempting for historic preservation programs. It's maybe easier for historic preservation programs to teach us that architectural style and maybe a little bit construction are paramount things, and they are really important to the work that we do. But function is something that is equally as important. We have a lot of buildings in North Carolina that may not have any style or they have a style, but it's not really what's compelling about them. And so we want to encourage you to think about function as being at least on par with style. And certainly we want you to think of construction and design and form as being the equal of style. Our status programs, our study list, our DOEs, our National Register, they prioritize patterns of continuity. That's not universally true across the board. There are exceptions to that rule, but we put so much emphasis on buildings that are exactly like they were when they were first built or when they went through a major and important change in their design. But when we're doing field work, we also want to recognize patterns of change over time, as well as whether or not something has great integrity, because there's an ongoing pattern of continuity. And we can also understand through fieldwork why and how people adopted or adapted aspects of material culture in response to local realities or their personal preferences. So, you know, there's so many great places in North Carolina where we see an architect or a builder who really dominated the built environment at that particular moment in time, and how that person's own personal sense of style adapted something that was nationally popular to be this great expression of Caswell County or Warren County or any of our other, you know, wonderful local builders that changed their environment and adapted something that was nationally popular. And then fieldwork gives us the best chance of capturing a fuller and more representative picture of the history of a place and the interrelatedness of the people who lived there. Certainly, we are always at a disadvantage. History is always going to be told by the winners. History will always advantage people who had the means to leave a record behind. But fieldwork is our best chance of expanding our historic record beyond the people who could write things down or who bought and sold things or who were the primary political movers. But we cannot accomplish any of those things through fieldwork unless we engage in ongoing conversations with people who have the firsthand experience in those areas. And the only way to become a proficient oral historian is through practice. It can be a daunting task, and it can make you feel a little rusty sometimes, or there have been times where I've been sitting in the car thinking, all right, here we go, just get started, just get warmed up. And then, you know, I end up getting totally immersed in the person that I'm talking to or what I'm doing. But we've all had mornings where we've gotten up and thought, I'm gonna go survey a church today. Probably no one will talk to me at the church. I don't have to knock on the door of the church. But then we've all had, you know, some of our best experiences by knocking on a door and meeting somebody that we didn't expect to meet that day. One of the best ways to start, of course, is to introduce yourself. For whatever reason, I have often found that it does not follow that someone is going to tell you their name. So even though it feels awkward, you often have to say, I'm Beth King, I work for the SHPO, I'm here at your house for this reason. May I ask your name? Because it often is not forthcoming. And then sometimes you could start with, do you own this house? Do you know who might have built this house? Just an easy softball question to help that person understand why you're at their door and what you're interested in. You want to listen attentively as possible, non-verbally if you can do it. People will often stop talking if they think you'd rather be the person talking. Try not to ask yes or no questions as much as you can. Instead of asking, do you know how old this house is, you could say something like, what would you say the date that this was built? Or do you know, do you have a neighbor who might know something about? Just try to avoid a situation where someone can just be like, I don't know anything. That will certainly happen. But the more that you can ask them to be involved, even if they're sort of speculating or talking you through some of their thought process, the better result that you'll probably have. Sometimes I think when you ask someone, do you have a sense of how old this house is? They'll say, I don't know, I think it's pretty old because there's this weird thing in the kitchen. And then they're starting to tell you about the inside of the house and what makes them think that, that it was old or that something happened to it at a certain point. And you're starting to get, great information from someone who otherwise might have just told you that they didn't know anything about it. Ask about the things that aren't on site. This can be particularly important for outbuildings in this day and age when so many have been lost or just have been out of service for so long that they're in really decrepit shape. There are some people that just aren't that interested in houses, but they really love how a farm operated. Or maybe they followed their grandfather around when they were a kid, and he just wasn't an indoors person, so they went around to all these little outbuildings shadowing him, and they can tell you all about those, but they don't really know that much about the inside of the house. Try to keep the conversation going towards tangible things whenever possible. Of course, everybody wants to talk about current events. Everybody wants to tell you what's wrong with this country and why their county is falling apart. But as much as possible, steer the conversation back towards, so you're thinking that this was a wash house, or the porch looks like it could have been replaced at some point. Do you remember your grandmother ever talking about a new porch? The more tangible your questions can be, the more you can steer back to the historic building, the better the outcome, and the more efficient your time. And then it's just the truth that some folks are not good interviewees. They may not be having the best day, they may not be feeling well, they might just like you to leave so they can get back to whatever they were doing. And it's part of the learning process to know when it's time to move on. The constituent is not always right. If someone's making you uncomfortable, especially if someone is actively harassing you, please move on. Please don't stay there and sit in that uncomfortableness. If someone is insisting on telling you their personal version of history, just try to steer that conversation back to the tangible as much as possible. Make a good faith effort and then move on. Include your experience in the survey record, good, bad, or ugly. Of course, we don't want our public records to have anything specifically negative about our constituents, but it is okay to say that you talked to the homeowner or the renter and information was not forthcoming, and so you moved on. All right. Any questions or comments before we move on?
Beth, I have one. I think it's obvious from what you've been saying that field workers, surveyors, are expected to get out of the car and knock on the door. So if no one comes to the door, what happens then? What do you recommend? Do you take a few pictures as you're walking back to the car? How should you proceed?
Thanks, Claudia, for that question. And I'm going to repeat it just in case that's needed for the other side of the room. So Claudia's question was, if you've gotten out of the car, if you've knocked on the door and no one's there, which of course is very common in this day and age, especially in rural areas, what should you do next? Should you just leave? Should you attempt to do some field work? My blanket recommendation for that is to try to make yourself as visible as possible. So if no one's home at the particular house that you're interested in, I would sort of have my head on a swivel looking for a neighbor, somebody who might look out for that building. If you're truly out there by yourself, then I would probably step back, at least into the driveway, maybe into the public right-of-way if you're not far from the house, and take a couple of overall photographs. And at that point, I would probably recommend moving on without any more permission to access the property, without any other human contact. In an ideal situation, even if somebody's not home, you would get a neighbor who would come looking to see what's going on. as more and more people move out of rural America or just have to go to work somewhere else, that might be less and less of a common thing. But I would recommend that you do minimal documentation and then see if you can't meet somebody down the road who might be able to give you some additional information if you don't meet somebody right there on site. Do you have any follow-up thoughts on that, Claudia? Kelly?
And usually, we have recommended having some kind of a flyer that has your information on it, so when people, maybe they see on their ring doorbell that somebody was there, they have the reason that somebody was there, and then hopefully can contact you later, and you can make contact that way, maybe even make an appointment to go back.
Yeah, Kelly's recommendation is to have a project flyer to leave behind that could possibly be seen by someone. I know it's harder and harder to find people's phone numbers, but I have certainly stopped somewhere, really wanted to talk to a person, and then found a phone number. This was back when phone books were a little bit easier to come by, but and then there's always, I think, like circling back with, if you're lucky enough to have a person who's sort of the expert on that section of the county or that neighborhood and that municipality, I think there's always like the opportunity to circle back with somebody who might say, well, you know, I think that house got left to her niece and she lives in another city, but she's there on the weekends, that kind of thing. Mary Griffin, did you?
I was going to say the same thing. I mean, usually if you're surveying for a municipality, you have a letter that explains who you are, and you take a stack of it with you, and if someone's not there, you leave it in the door so the neighbor sees you walking up to the door and taking pictures. They've seen that you've left something. So it sometimes diffuses the situation. Or if the property owner doesn't answer you because they don't want to talk to you, and then they see you out the window taking pictures, and you've left something at the door, you can say, oh, here, let me show you what I left you. So.
Yes, absolutely. I think, and Mary Ruffin again was reiterating the importance of having a flyer or a letter of some kind. And I think that sort of the commonality between all these comments is that we do want to be as visible as possible, and we want to immediately have something to demonstrate why we're doing, what we're doing, why we're there, who we are, and lend some legitimacy to, you know, the fact that we're there with a camera in the middle of the day, which is a weird experience for a lot of people. I started doing architectural survey before I ever owned a house, and after I bought my first house, all of a sudden I thought, this is actually a really weird thing that we do. And when I was 24, I was like, this is my career, this is what I do. And then after I bought a house when I was 30, I was like, yeah, this is a really weird thing that we do. This is really strange. So it did change my perspective on that. But I think the great takeaway point here is to be as visible as possible, to appear as legitimate as possible, and to be ready to explain yourself and to have some documentation, and then to have something to leave behind just in case you can catch somebody that way, especially if the house appears to be lived in and occupied, and you just think that this person probably works in town or, you know, works somewhere during the bulk of the day when we're out surveying. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
So I find, especially when I'm interviewing older people in rural areas, I tend to code switch and revert to incredibly polite Southerners with like, oh, Miss Beth, you know, and everything, and accent comes out as well. I guess it's more of a general comment or asking around, like, does anybody else find themselves doing that as find more success in that regard? Because sometimes it's just
Yes, we do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that especially when you're talking to older people, I think that it can be really appreciated to be as polite as possible, and the ma'ams and everything, I think, go a long way.
And depending on the situation, sometimes I wear a yellow vest, and then we have these badges that are completely fake badges because we don't have any, you know, but they have our picture on it.
Yeah.
And sometimes that can be a little comforting to people because we could be the cable guy or the whatever, but it can be.
I've actually been told by people that they
cards in the car, but not physically on me, and she scolded me for that. Not Jennifer, the person I was talking to, scolded me and said, you really should have some kind of, something to hand to people. So.
And also, if you're on the side of the road taking the picture, you should really, people are on their cell phones now, and they can just take you out in a second. So it's good to be seen that way. I also have I have a cone in my car, or I have to park on the side of the road. I've been hit, I've been, whatever. So being visible, I think, is, in some situations, most situations, is the best.
And not that we want to trespass, but a former boss and I used to often joke about what you could probably get away with if you're just wearing an orange vest and carrying a clipboard.
Yeah. And honestly, sorry, but if you really need a picture of something, that's when the phone comes in handy. You're not doing this with your big thing. You can just kind of be a little, sorry, this is kind of.
No, it's true. We have definitely done that to things that we could not. If something like, say, is up a hill in the mountains, and you're like, well, that's quite a commitment to try to get all the way up there without permission. Yeah, there's like I say, I certainly don't mean to suggest that there's never a time to use a mobile camera. I just don't. I think there are times where you just can't beat a DSLR.
I want to say one more thing about safety. If you're doing work for the municipality and you do have an issue, I think it's perfectly reasonable as a municipality to have a dedicated phone number for someone in law enforcement. I had a guy who followed me around for several blocks in this my urban area, muttering under his breath, and I had the sheriff on speed dial. And the next time I saw him, I called.
Yeah. So Mary Griffin's comment was about local law enforcement and having some folks with her in certain situations. But also whenever we're doing a project in-house, I've had at least one fun conversation with the county sheriff's department just to say, I'm sure someone is going to call you this week because they're going to see this car moving around. They're not necessarily going to know what it is. So it's us. If you have a problem, please call. Sometimes they call me when it has nothing to do with an architectural survey, because then you sort of set yourself up to be blamed for everything that happens in the county that week. But I would rather get a call for a school bus incident that has nothing to do with architectural survey, true story, than I would for our folks to be mistaken for something nefarious. So I also like to talk to the county planners and county management type folks too, if we're doing a project in-house, just so when they're getting calls from people, they're familiar. And of course, same thing, if you're doing a municipal survey, hopefully you're already enmeshed with somebody in that municipality, but if not, it's always, I think, worth a half an hour to go talk to the municipal or the county planner.
Beth?
Yes.
I had an experience. I was advised in a dicey part of a city. I was advised by the planning department that if I was concerned about my safety, I should walk with the mailman. Because no one bothers the mailman who brings the Social Security checks, et cetera, et cetera. And I did it. I had to do it for a couple of neighborhoods.
Yeah. Claudia is saying that at one point she was surveying sort of behind the mailman because the mailman is, he's just part of the furniture. Nobody's questioning why he's in the neighborhood.
Just kind of backing up since we're talking about safety and planning. It's always a good idea. It's a CLG grant that you have for benefit. It's usually with the municipality, or if it's privately funded, there's usually a contact to have some sort, maybe not a committee, but a couple of people who are your go-tos. Because there's always a couple of people in every community who know everybody and everything. And when I did the federal survey, which was way too
absolutely. Thank you, Michelle. Yes, we also will run a public, or through our public information officer, we'll run a press release. It's sometimes I debate about what's really the best platform for that, just because so few people read the newspaper anymore. But a lot of times your local partner has a Facebook page they can, or some kind of social media that they can post to. So I think hopefully that helps with visibility too.
And just to follow on that, can also be a general opportunity for you all to update the community on their Facebook page if you're listening to the project.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've seen in a couple of projects recently how important Facebook or another form of social media is to just finding people who want to talk about buildings in areas where everyone seems to have left their property behind. Okay. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about our priorities for survey. If you've done a recent survey, this is often customized to project, but we also often include something of this nature in the methodology section. But we get questions sometimes about how do we prioritize what we want to survey during the windshield or the scoping phase. And so I have put together some notes that we kind of use and customize as needed from project to project. So first and foremost, of course, we're looking for historic properties with high material integrity and/or design elements, even if the integrity is a little lesser, that are important to local history and culture. That's sort of the root of everything we're doing as architectural historians. We're looking for great buildings. But we're also looking for distinguishable neighborhoods, rural communities, or commercial and industrial areas. So maybe the individual components aren't that strong, but it holds together as a distinguishable historic entity. We also look for farmsteads with complexes of intact agricultural buildings and field patterns, especially now that that we're losing so many agricultural complexes at such a rate. We are always looking for the places that can best represent the agricultural history through a major retention of those buildings. We're also looking for buildings that serve as important community gathering places, like churches, schools, fraternal buildings, and stores. We're looking beyond where people live and where people go to work, and we're looking for places where people gather and form community. And these places, I think, many of them are fading as people less and less have those third spaces where they go. We're also looking for buildings that house major employers or other mainstays of the local economy. Some of these are not beautiful things. We are looking for the textile mills that ran into the 1990s and that just have that running bond brick veneer, but 25% of the small town worked there. Or the furniture factory or the tobacco warehouse. These are not necessarily things that are super exciting from an architectural standpoint, although some have a really great industrial look to them. But some of them are very plain, but they were very important to the local economy into the 1970s. And then last but not least, we're looking for properties associated with groups of people who've been underrepresented in prior surveys, in National Register nominations, and or in the published histories of the survey area. And this, of course, is the hardest one to get in a windshield survey, but this is some of the most important and richest material that's gathered when you've got someone in the survey area who can tell you what things are and explain to you the value of things. So you might miss quite a lot of these in your first pass, but you might go back and include a lot of important, the houses of local leaders or the gathering place for a major activity. Those kind of things will become more evident as you get to know the survey area and especially as you get to know the people of that area.
Has underrepresented become a flag for federal programs yet, like other boards have?
To my knowledge, underrepresented is still a safe word for us to use, but it is certainly something that we could overuse. And as far as I know, it hasn't been flagged as a word for a DEI word, I guess. As far as I know, it hasn't been flagged yet, but it is certainly something we throw around a lot. And
We have not had any kind of directives at the state level about words to use or not use. Nobody's been messing with us yet.
yeah. Yeah.
And I think we heard from Secretary Cashwell this morning. I mean, I guess she can't make any kind of hard or fast promises, but in terms of some of these buzzwords and DEI things and underrepresented communities, we're operating business as usual, and that still remains a priority for us. So.
Could people hear Sarah's response adequately? Okay, and then I wanted to talk a little bit about what happens to the survey files after the survey is over with. We've had some questions lately about whether our survey files just essentially like go and sit on the shelf after the project is over with. Do they get pulled out? Do they get used? Who uses the survey files? What purpose do they serve after the life of the survey project? I have the sense that we have fewer people coming to visit our file room since the pandemic. Certainly, I think in the Asheville office, we've been scanning a lot of material to people when it's needed, and I could be totally wrong about the Raleigh file office. But I do want to make sure everyone's aware that these survey files are pulled on and off the shelf on a daily basis. Because, as we talked about, the survey is the base of information for preservation planning and action. We absolutely need the files that are generated, whether we're talking about the true old-fashioned paper file or whether we're talking about the digital material. We, in our staff, are touching hundreds of records at least a week. On a really heavy week, I don't think it's a stretch to say thousands of records, but certainly throughout the year, we are touching and using and calling on and retrieving and improving a tremendous number of our records every year. Our survey files are a lot like the vertical files in a library. If you've had the experience of going into a local library and maybe they have a filing cabinet, maybe they have them on the shelf, but they've got things like newspaper clippings and brochures from past events and things like that, these are not things that get laid flat in an archive and are there when you need them, but they basically are static records. These are things that are constantly being added to, maintained, and preserved. And a lot of us have Google alerts set for any number of either preservation issues or places around the state. And so we're constantly printing out news articles and throwing them in the file, or someone calls us and we update the record. The survey files are really critical to our staff's roles in our goals in constituent service, public education, and public outreach. So we all get a certain number of cold calls from the public every day. And a lot of us, you'll hear in our voicemail that we have something like, "You've reached the voicemail of Beth King. Please leave me the 911 address of the property about which you're calling." And a lot of that is so we can go pull the file, or we can get something up in the database or on HBO Web before we call that person back, so that we know exactly how to answer their questions. So we're constantly drawing from our state archive to talk to the members of the public in our territories. They're also incredibly important for staff enrichment and for our growing education and knowledge. And the real reason that that's important is that allows us to give better constituent services to the folks who call on us. So we're learning every time that we do a survey or a National Register project, and we're passing that right along to the public. It means that we're able to serve people better, and we greatly appreciate the ability to be more informed and better educated about the things that folks want us to know. And then every bit of training and educational outreach that we do, we pull from the survey files. We pull photographs, we pull information. Every bit of that comes out of the survey program or out of a National Register project. And then lastly, our publications that many of you are familiar with from the survey program. All of that comes out of survey projects and out of the files. So I think that there have been a number of times where I've been really touched to get a call from someone who was looking for an old photograph of something that may or may not still be standing. Maybe it's standing, but it's not in great shape. And just the way that people are very emotional and are just genuinely grateful that there's a record that we can draw on to give them a representation of something that they love or they remember or that they've heard about. These are all examples of things that happened to our survey files once the project is over. Very active, very living records.
I know
Yes.
a lot of your survey files have been scanned. Is there any movement to make those available without having to call Chandra or tying it into HPO GIS or connecting that GIS database with the HPO database so that one can, get on at 11 o'clock at night and pull in on old survey photos and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Andy, are you talking about any of that later? Okay, just wanted to make sure. Yes, so Mary Ruffin was asking about any movement towards making the survey files more accessible. We are working closely with our IT department to draw up a scope of work that will essentially allow us to have a database that talks directly to HPO Web. We are meeting with them every week, but we just started meeting with them 2 weeks ago. So we are in very early stages of drawing up the scope of work. We are very hopeful that that's something our IT department could help us with internally, but it may be beyond their staff capacity, in which case we would have to find a consulting firm to do it for us, which would be very expensive. So we would also have to find, we're working on the scope of work. If IT can't do it internally, we will have to start looking for the money to do it externally. So it's a little bit difficult to say where we are in that process.
We have a I don't know if you would call it a scope of work, but we have a concept outline, and Ramona has used that to help put together a budget request to do this work, and then sort of simultaneously we're also working on directing sorting out the specifics of a scope of work. And it may be that we don't really need that money because we can do it in-house. I think we probably still have to pay the IT in-house and pay for whatever type of software upgrade we would need or something like that. The idea is that eventually, yes, you can click on a point on our map and you will be able to see more information. You'll be able to see what we have in our database. Ideally, what we have scanned. Part of the whole project would be scanning all of our records, all of our paper records, and trying to come out with, I know Andy's looked at a lot of different states' websites. I have as well. My personal favorite is Maryland's. Really like Maryland's, and would love our system to look like that. And also, additionally, a portal for you all to do your data entry on a web-based portal, so that we don't have to send shell databases back and forth to you, and you're not wedded to not having a Mac. So. Did
that answer your whole question? Great, thank you, Sarah. Yes, this is like the dearest desire of our hearts. So we are very eager to see some change and improvement. So, anything else? All right. Doing good. So till 2:30? Yeah, okay. All right, so this is the last section of what we're going to talk about before our fieldwork panel discussion, and we're just going to talk a little bit about writing about history. Historic writing is analytic. It is supposed to describe and examine the relationship between parties, and it should move beyond simple description and list of facts. I know that it can be tempting to get bogged down in reciting facts, especially if we're dealing with a topic that feels like it's been talked to death. But there is always a way to take even the most accepted fact about history and apply it to the study area in which you're working. Whether or not you think that historic truism holds true in your study area, or whether you think you've got some great example of why this pattern doesn't play out in your study area, just make sure that you're analyzing and interpreting the fieldwork that you've just finished. In our profession, of course, we're also making arguments, whether something is eligible for the National Register, typically being the biggest one. When we think about developing historic context and we're selecting our topic and our sources of information, we are almost always working geographically. And sometimes this is just as simple as the extent of your project scope. But on significant and probably rare occasions, you'll be looking for comparisons that might fall outside of your immediate scope, especially if you're thinking about something like statewide significance. Chronology means that you'll be organizing your arguments and descriptions according to a timeline that's moving forward in time, and you're recognizing units of time that are specific and reasonable. Almost everywhere in North Carolina, it is reasonable to divide construction between things that were happening before the Civil War and things that were happening after the war, because there is typically a huge difference when standardized lumber and finished nails and things like that start arriving, typically after the Civil War, sometimes slightly before. So there's usually a very reasonable break in your project, right around that time, right around the mid-19th century. But depending on where you're working, as you think about the 20th century, you may have very different breaks in time based on the resources that you find in your study area. But above all, you want to emphasize the period of time for which you have surviving resources. I think as historians, there is a real temptation to think, well, the older, the better. The farther that we can go back in time, the more interesting, the more compelling, the better. But if most of what you surveyed is from the 20th century, and most of the resources that have been written already about your survey area focus on, say, the Civil War and earlier, then the gap that you want to fill is going to be related to the period of time in which those 20th century resources were being constructed and used. When we think about primary sources in historic preservation, we want to emphasize the buildings, the artifacts, and the people who used them. So we want to be relying on the material culture that we're encountering, and we want to rely on the people who know those places the best. You should be using your own observations and the observations of the people who are closest to the resources. In many, many cases, you're not going to find something that covers in the depth and the specificity that you need exactly what happened in this town on this date. But that's the exciting part, because you're going to be the person that other people quote on what happened in this town and this date. You're filling in that gap. So make sure that you can cite sources, including yourself, transparently. Make sure you're writing things like, based on our observations of North Elm Street, the colonial revival appears to have been the most popular in this town during this period of time. You're the person who's going to know that the best. So give yourself credit, and give yourself credit for the work that you did during field work. When you're looking for secondary sources, you want to start as close to the resource as possible and gradually expand your focus outward. There is absolutely nothing wrong with Virginia McAllister, but don't start with Virginia McAllister. If you need to start outside of your absolute immediate study area, start with a county survey publication or start with a guidebook and work your way up to Catherine's big book. But stay in the state as much as possible. Of course, as we move forward in time, then when we get to the mid-20th century, there may be a really good resource that you can use that was written for another state. But at least before World War II, stay in North Carolina and use some of these wonderful resources that we're really lucky to have here. There are also some great statewide secondary sources that can be really essential to you in developing historic context. There are a couple of things that are shown here on the screen, and also our survey manual, Practical Advice for Recording Historic Resources. 2022 is the latest date on that. Pages 14 through 18 provide some ideas for secondary source research, and that was very kindly provided by our historic research branch in DNCR. So the folks who know something about researching North Carolina history mostly provided that section.
Could you maybe speak a little bit to your experience in having to do that outside of North Carolina? Like maybe you're on a border county, but you need to go to Virginia to get what you want versus it's actually in North Carolina?
Yeah, that's a good point. So if you were surveying up on the Virginia line, you probably would want to know what was going on in Halifax County, Virginia, or Sarah says never Virginia.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yes, you will have to potentially look. People did cross the state line, and there's a lot of family connections when you're in a border county, certainly along North or South Carolina. I myself have done almost pretty much no work along the Tennessee border, but I assume it's the same, just a lot of kinship. And so you might be back and forth. But what in terms of like that North Carolina 3-4 centuries, that's really a textbook, and it's really broad and big scope. What's its contained in Virginia, I don't actually know, but someone does.
In Western North Carolina especially, it's important to development of tourism from Georgia and South Carolina.
Florida, certain parts.
Yeah, Florida, New Orleans is a huge influence, and like highways that Georgia built to go into North Carolina for tourism. So that's where you have a more regional understanding of what's happening.
Sure. And certainly some places in our southern mountains that are really heavily influenced by the low country of South Carolina. That would be a good time to look outside the state. I guess in general, don't start in Cincinnati, Ohio. But yes, certainly that's a very good point, Matt, that there are times where we touch another state, and it is helpful to know. I think a lot of our Virginia line counties have not been surveyed very well in Virginia. Some of them have, but I think a lot of them are far enough away from Richmond and Charlottesville, they haven't been very well surveyed. So there may not be a lot of help. And then I think sometimes the North Carolina Historical Review is overlooked. As Sarah was saying, North Carolina through 4 centuries is a big, broad, as it has to be, a big, broad text. But the North Carolina Historical Review has so many I'm almost tempted to say niche aspects of history. Like, there's the classic one on rice production in the Cape Fear River that's got way more detail and information on that aspect of North Carolina history than any general overview could. And the nice thing about NCHR is that it is available on JSTOR with a moving wall of 3 years. So I think that they should be up to 2021 being accessible on JSTOR. If you don't have another means of accessing JSTOR, if you have a government and heritage library card, then you can sign into the North Carolina library system. I mean, if you are a North Carolina resident, you can use your local library card too. But if you're visiting us today from another state and you want access to all of the resources that are available through our library, tomorrow, when we're back over on Jones Street, you can go into the Government and Heritage Library and get a library card right that moment, and then you'll have access to everything that local library holders have too. And then why this is important, of course, is because context reports cannot be exhaustive. There's just absolutely no way to deal with 200 or 250 years of history, plus all the material culture that history produced, the buildings and landscapes, in one survey report. So in this day and age, we're doing a lot of survey updates. So think about if there's a last survey of your area, think about where they left off and whether there are any gaps that need to be filled, or if you can say in your report, this National Register nomination provides context for this time period, or this survey report that's 40 years old took us up to the Great Depression. And so therefore this survey report is going to bring us forward to the 70s or even the 80s. If there's never been a survey of your area and you're starting out, then you've got quite a lot to organize. Think about potentially preparing a scoping report to get yourself organized, or an outline. You could also consider submitting an outline or a bibliography as one of the first deliverables on your time product payment schedule, because that can be a problem. You want to get paid. You need to start getting paid before you're ready to turn in survey files or your final report. Or maybe you send in a bibliography or a report outline as a deliverable to demonstrate all the work that you are already doing to get the survey started. And that's all I have for today, except to say again, thank you very much for all of the work that you're doing all over the state, all the time. And we just are really grateful you could be here today, and look forward to our continuing conversation.
All right, thanks to everyone for your attention. We are going to take a break. I just sort of hopped right in this morning because Dr. Waters and Ramona both had some other commitments. But if the HPO staff that are here would like to stand up and at least give a little wave. Not everybody's here right now, I don't think, but a lot of people are. Just give a little wave. All right. So. All right, so we will take a break and we will reconvene at, what did I say, 2:45? That's a little bit, yeah. About 2:45 we'll come back together and keep it moving. Thank you.